Hello and welcome to the West Yorkshire Football Show. Something a bit different on the channel today after the sad news of Kevin Keegan's passing at the age of 75. We thought we'd get together on the West Yorkshire Football Show, pay our own tribute. I'm delighted to say joining me is Gareth Walker, obviously Liverpool affiliations, Liverpool supporter. We're also going to hear from Lewis Sale as well. He sent over a video about Keegan's time at Newcastle and his reflections on that, which we're really looking forward to seeing. If you're watching along, get your comments in, any memories or any stories or anything you want to say about King Kev. Like the video, get subscribed to the channel as well. Gaz, one of them, when the story kind of dropped, when the news came out that he'd passed on a couple of days ago, I kind of, even though I'm a Leeds fan, he never played for Leeds or anything like that, but it felt massive. It felt huge, a big icon of the game, the English game, massively successful. And it's kind of weird because it feels with Kevin Keegan a little bit like he was kind of off the radar for a few years. He wasn't one of them that you always heard about in the news. He wasn't on all these podcasts and everything like that. He wasn't kind of in your face or anything like that. So when you hear that news, obviously he'd been diagnosed with an illness recently, and now he's passed on very sadly. But yeah, an absolute titan of the game, mate. Huge, and some of the tributes pouring in it. I mean, it says everything about the man, doesn't it?
Yeah, he's had a lot of people speaking so highly of him, hasn't he? I mean, I spoke to a few people about him, and one thing you hear everybody say is no one has a bad word to say about him, do they? Everybody's so positive about him, which obviously is a testament to the man himself. Like you say, he'd been diagnosed of being ill not so long ago. It does seem like it were quite recent, and I think they'd said that there wasn't a lot that they cocould do for him. So we knew it was coming, but it had been fairly quiet before that. And then since then, really, until the news broke yesterday, obviously. Just one of those people that everybody seemed to like I say, and a man of the people. He, from what I can gather, he grew up in the northeast and working class family, and always sort of maintained a bit of loyalty to those working class roots, and people liked him. And I'm sure we'll come on to his time with England later on, but I remember, you probably remember it as well, when he resigned from the England job, and he basically resigned live on telly after a defeat, and he said the thing that made him resign was the reaction of the supporters, because the supporters loved him and they'd always been so positive about him. And then when they lost that game, the last game at Wembley against Germany, the old Wembley against Germany, and he felt the fans turning on him, he said then he knew it was the time to go. He's just one of those guys that everybody liked and respected, and he felt, I suppose, that yeah, that's what he lived for, the respect and the loyalty of the fans, and when he lost that, he felt that was the time to resign from England job, which again is another testament of him, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're a couple of weeks after, well, not even a couple of weeks, about a week or so since England's exit, and you just wouldn't see a modern manager kind of do that this day and age, would you? Kind of walk away. They all kind of grip on and hang on for dear life. So yeah, absolute testament to the man. Kind of going back then, obviously starting with his career path. Obviously started at Scunthorpe and then got the move to Liverpool. Bill Shankly signed him and was obviously a massive influence to Keegan. And I mean, an icon, really, wasn't he? I mean, you had George Best, obviously, kind of before him, but in terms of that next British kind of global superstar, it was certainly Keegan, and what he achieved at Liverpool was absolutely massive, Gaz.
Yeah, like I say, come from a working class background. I think he'd had trials at a few different clubs, and then eventually Scunthorpe took him on. Did reasonably well at Scunthorpe, I think, playing more as a midfielder, from what I can gather, a little bit out on the right-hand side. And then he got to Liverpool, and something, I read a quote from Shankly about him that basically he just raved about his enthusiasm. He said that basically he's never seen anyone have an enthusiasm for football like Kevin Keegan had, and basically said so many players are good players or they have ability, but he had the enthusiasm for all 11 players out on the pitch. And I think they got him for, I think I wrote down 33 grand they paid for him at 20-year-old. I mean, I don't know what kind of fee that was then, but he more than paid that back. 100 goals I think he got for Liverpool. 68 in the league. Became one of the, suppose, really sort of the false nines. One of the first sort of false nines. He sort of played off Toshak, and obviously when you look back at that period of time from like the mid-60s up to when he left in the late 70s, he had, I think, Yeah, they were building with Liverpool, weren't they? Obviously, Shankly brought them up from the second division, and they built them into like possibly one of the best teams or the best team in the country at the time. And Keegan was a massive part of that, and the partnership that he had with Toshak up front. There's loads of famous commentaries, and Toshak Keegan 1-0. The number of times the commentator said things like that was unbelievable. One of sort of the first sort of big strike partnerships, as you were. He won helped Liverpool win a first title in 7 years after they'd initially started coming up, obviously, from the second division with Shankly. Just a nice guy who worked really, really hard. Like I say, working class roots and very, very down to earth. And just reading here, he won how many league titles did he win at Liverpool? He won 3 league titles and the European Cup. He won, his last game for Liverpool was actually the first time they won the European Cup. That was his last game, and I think he didn't score, but arguably man of the match in that game. His first manager at Scunthorpe described him as a 100%er, and he was actually moved from that right hand side up front because he was too much of a free running around headless chicken kind of player. So they moved him up front, and it worked, didn't it? And that's where he ended up playing his career as that false nine. Just a quote from the Liverpool for Shankly devoted an entire chapter to him in his autobiography, which shows what Shankly thought of him. Just said it was called A Boy Called Keegan, and that was the title of the chapter. And he said he was the inspiration of his new team. Shankly's relationship with Keegan, he wrote, "Liverpool made me not just as a footballer but as a person." That's what Keegan said. Kevin Keegan was Liverpool's superstar of much of the 1970s, signed off by helping them win the club's first European Cup on his final appearance. He was nimble, skillful, courageous, and a non-stop attitude of a player. Keegan's superb strike partnership with John Toshak plundered exactly a centuries of goals for him wearing the Liverpool red. Just ran himself ragged every game, and apparently in that cup final he was man marked and still arguably man of the match, just outran Bertie Vogts, who obviously came on to be German manager. So yeah, just had a fantastic career. I think at Liverpool, he said the only thing he was afraid of was in football was he was always afraid if he ever was to miss an open goal in front of the Kop. That's the only thing that had scared him. And he sometimes said when they were singing "You'll Never Walk Alone," he'd be crying while he were playing because it was just so emotional for him. So just shows you what a down to earth guy he was, Browney. And I think he probably, I read that they had a recent vote at Liverpool where they voted for what Liverpool's 100 greatest players, and it's like the third time that they've done that. They did it in 2006, they did it in 2013, and they did it again this year. And in the 2006 vote, he came 8th. In the 2013 vote, he came 19th. And this year, he came 14th. And the one thing that struck me reading that was I think he would have probably come higher if the man who replaced him hadn't have been so successful, because obviously the man who they brought in to replace him was Kenny Dalglish. He was signed as Keegan's replacement. Keegan went to Hamburg for £500,000, which was massive money in those days. And Dalglish came in for £440,000, so they nearly spent all the money on Dalglish. Dalglish obviously went on to be Liverpool's greatest ever player, and they call him King Kenny. Well, they called Keegan King Kev, so it just shows you, doesn't it? I think he would have been even higher up in that ranking if it weren't for what followed him, really.
Yeah, I've kind of seen stuff about that, and kind of the fact of maybe kind of how he left at the time, and announced he was leaving, and it probably kind of dimmed a little bit of light on his Liverpool legacy, only slightly. Obviously, still achieved massive amounts and everything. And it's funny as well because you talk about his hard work and his work ethic. I mean, there's been some fantastic clips going around X from interviews of him and old clips and stuff. And there was one clip I saw where he didn't maybe have all the natural talent as a footballer, but he worked harder than anyone else. He was saying, where he grew up, there were 40 better players than him in his local town. So for him to kind of make it, and end up a Ballon d'Or winner back to back, just shows you kind of the work ethic of the man. I just want to pull up. You mentioned some of the trophies he's won, and we've got this graphic here. This is his trophy cabinet as a player. I mean, won everything in the English game there, and 3 times champion, Division 1 winner, a couple of UEFA Cup goal wins as well. There's one I saw a clip today. He scores a fantastic goal, lobs the keeper from about 40 yards or something. It's fantastic. FA Cup winner as well, Super Cup winner, and then obviously, like you mentioned, Gaz, on his final game for Liverpool, also Champions League winner as well. There is a kind of Leeds link with Keegan as well that I've always been fascinated by. And Leeds won the league in '74, Liverpool won the cup, so they ended up playing each other in the Charity Shield. Brian Clough was in charge of Leeds, and Keegan and Bremner got sent off scrapping, and it was Johnny Giles who wound Keegan up, but it were Billy Bremner who ended up taking the full force, and it's quite iconic. They ripped the shirts off, the storm off down the tunnel and everything. But actually, Keegan, because I did read Keegan's book a few years ago, and he had a really good relationship with Don Revie. It was kind of, because Don Revie's kind of tenure as England manager is always kind of frowned upon a little bit for one reason or another. But actually, Keegan spoke really highly of him, and Keegan played at like a tribute match they had for Don Revie when he got sick, and so there is footage of Keegan in a Leeds kit, which is nice. But yeah, just one of those things you look back at, when you see the old footage and think, it must have been absolutely wild thing to see at a Charity Shield game.
I wondered if you'd bring that up, Browney. I thought you might. We're the first people to be sent off in the Charity Shield, weren't they, the pair of them? And I actually read, again, similar to what you read, apparently ended up later in his career being really good mates with Billy Bremner and Johnny Giles. They actually ended up, him and Keegan got on really well with both of them. So goodness knows what happened that day, really. But I think Bremner got an 8-game ban or something, didn't he, for what he did that day. So they both got bans, but obviously made up later down the line. And like I said at the start, he probably were someone who were difficult not to make up with, because nobody has a bad word to say about him. So he actually, I think we'll come on to it when we talk about his time at Hamburg, but it wasn't the only time that he threw punches on a field either. But maybe that grasp and that attitude and comes from his working, not necessarily saying that working class people are more likely to fight, but just a grafter, wasn't he? And his dad came from a colliery in the northeast, and like you say, we just taught that graft was what will get him anywhere, and that's what happened. It came from his father, and graft, and it worked for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned obviously going into that Hamburg move, which at the time that must have been a kind of startling thing to see. Probably the best British player at the time move abroad, move to Germany, and obviously it doesn't happen so much these days. I think British players integrate better when they go abroad now, but certainly kind of that era, British players going abroad, there was always kind of, situations like, when Ian Rush went to Juventus and there's a lot of examples where it didn't really work for British players abroad. And I did see them talking about first 6 months were hard for him at Hamburg, but he turned it around and kind of managed to get himself integrated in the end. And obviously, this is the same time he wins 2 Ballon d'Ors back to back. And I mean, that's insane. That as an achievement is off the scale. To get it back to back is just incredible. But I mean, what a journey to be brave enough to make that move. He's probably very comfortable at Liverpool, very successful at Liverpool. So to go and do that, leave, who were the European champions at that point, to go try it in another country and make such a success of it and win, Player of the Year and Ballon d'Ors. I mean, it's unbelievable, really.
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a surprise move at the time, because I don't think Hamburg were like the biggest team in Germany either. So, like, the fact that he chose to go there, I mean, I don't know the reasons for that, but it paid off for him. I think I did read that he basically multiplied his salary by 4.5 times his Liverpool salary when he got to Hamburg. So, obviously more money in Germany than there was in the English game at that point. And I think they paid £500,000 for him, which would have been big money, like we said earlier at that time. You're right. He didn't settle in straight away. I watch an old program that I like watching. It's a really old program. It's you'll know, everyone's heard of it. It's called Auf Wiedersehen, Pep. But there's a quote in that when they're in Germany and they talk about integrating into the German culture, and they actually say we need to integrate like Kevin Keegan did, because that's what happened. And like you say, he struggled at first, and I think some of the players didn't take well to him because the manager. What had happened when he first signed was, in Germany, you were only allowed to have 2 foreign players in your team at the time. And the player that was moved out to bring him in was a European Footballer of the Year or a European Cup winner, one or the other, I can't remember. So he was a popular in the dressing room, and he was moved out to bring Keegan in. And then the coach left, and they thought that the coach that had been appointed was partly to get the best out of Keegan, so that the players didn't take to him straight away, and it took a long time. And he said, I think there was an interview where he said something about that one of the things he missed the most about England was the cereals that he could get in the UK. So all the German fans used to send boxes of English cereal to the training ground for him. He really struggled with the language. He said there was one time he went into a DIY store and he was trying to buy a fuse and he came out with Christmas lights. So that he really, really struggled. But there was an incident where we talked about him in the fight with Billy Bremner, and there was another incident in a game where apparently he was getting kicked from pillar to post and he lost his rag and he thumped somebody. He got sent off and he was out of the team for a period of time while he was suspended, and he used that time to try and integrate into the German culture. He basically decided, look, if I don't do it, it's not going to work. And he made a real effort and he started learning the German language, and from there on it all turned around for him. And like you say, I think he was at the time when he won those back-to-back Ballon d'Ors, he was only the fourth player ever to win the Ballon d'Or twice. So that shows what an achievement it was for him to do that. And he won. I think he helped Hamburg win the first title that they'd won it was the first time they'd won the title in 19 years, and he helped get them to the European Cup final, which they did lose. That was the year after, and they lost the title to Bayern Munich as well before he moved back to England, finished second that year. But the sort of progression of the team and the progression of him as a person while he was out there was obviously phenomenal.
Yeah, and I think it was Brian Clough Forest, wasn't it? They lost to in the European Cup final as well. So nice twist of fate there. Kind of wrapping up his playing career then. I mean, he came back, ended up joining Southampton, I think, which was a massive, massive surprise at the time. Southampton considered a smaller club, and obviously this superstar joining them had success there. Then he leaves and he has his first kind of affiliation with Newcastle, helps them before obviously retiring. And then he went into, I think basically was kind of away. There's a great story. I remember him saying where, he's away playing golf somewhere in Spain or something, and he's not really bothered about becoming a manager or anything like that. And Newcastle are in dire straits, basically. Good chance they could get relegated to Division 3, and I think it was John Hall. So John Hall had rung him up on the phone and trying to persuade him to take the job. And he was like, "There's only two people that can save this football club, and they're speaking to each other now." And it just kind of got Keegan's wheels turning, and he thought, "Yeah, let's give this a go." But before kind of me and Gaz reflect on that kind of stage of Keegan's life, there, I do want to bring in Lewis Sale as well, who is going to have a little chat about Keegan's time at Newcastle and what he meant to the Newcastle supporters.
Hi, Lewis here, reporting for the West Yorkshire Football Show, looking back on Kevin Keegan's career, especially at my beloved, as you can see there, in my barcode Newcastle United shirt on. Yeah, I mean, it's desperately, desperately sad to hear the passing of Kevin Keegan. He was actually the man who made me fall in love with Newcastle United, if I'm being honest. My earliest memory of him at Newcastle was when he was manager, but obviously being a Newcastle fan, and for those who support your own team, you do look back into history and see what legends may have come before you were born, and obviously he was that at Newcastle in terms of a player, and obviously before that at Hamburg and Liverpool. But he had a successful time as a player, helped us get promoted to second division, and then obviously became manager in 1992 when Newcastle were obviously just outside of Premier League at the time. But some of the players and the youth players that he had at his disposal, the likes of Steve Watson, Steve Howie, Robbie Elliott, Alan Thompson, for those that local area may be familiar with the left-footed midfielder, he just made that team into what it became, into what the 95-96-7 season. But listen, he was an unbelievable manager. It was so unlucky and so unfortunate, really, in fact, that he didn't win any trophy with us at Newcastle, but what he gave us was memories. And I know it does sound quite deep, does that, but when you're a football fan, if you can't get trophies, you just want memories, and that's exactly what Keegan did with ourselves. I mean, I remember, like I said earlier, my first memory was when he was manager, when he got us promoted. My first game I watched, from my memory, was when we beat Leicester 7-1 on the final day of the season, when we got promoted out of the First Division. And, the likes of David Kelly and Scott Sellers, just the names that you watched in black and white were a joy to watch. And Keegan, Terry McDermott, especially alongside him, Arthur Cox, Derek Fazakli later on as well, were part of his coaching team that was synonymous with Newcastle and us getting close to winning the Premier League. And what he also had was a real keen eye for talent. One of my favourite ever players wearing a Newcastle shirt was Andy Cole. He bought it from Bristol City. Relatively unknown, but Andy Cole was an absolute goal machine. Pretty much a local hero, pardon the pun, from the Geordie land, but you know, he revolutionised and transformed what we were all about. And you know, in that first season in the Premier League, you know, we were beating at the time like Swindon 7-1, and I remember we were on TV against Oldham at Boundary Park. You know, Peter Beardsley doing his little shimmy, put one in the back of the net, Andy Cole as well. And listen, the team was unbelievable to watch. And like I say, Kevin Keegan was the master at orchestrating that team. Obviously, memories of Kevin Keegan for those outside looking in will remember him from the, we'll love it outburst on TV in terms of Sir Alex Ferguson, Manchester United. And I remember actually going to St James's Park, funny enough, after we lost against Manchester United 1-0 when Eric Cantona scored it for my birthday. And we went for a tour straight after that game. And if my memory serves me right, there was a big hole in the door to the away dressing room, to the home dressing room. And I think it was allegedly, may have been Kevin Keegan at frustration at losing that game. So I think a few people at the time didn't have phones at the time, did we? We had, proper cameras, and we were taking pictures of the hole in the door because of how disappointed and angry that result, may have potentially cost Newcastle the title at the time. But then even after that, Kevin Keegan continued to make the headlines with Newcastle, signing a local hero, Alan Shearer, for £15 million at the time. And I've seen a lot of stuff recently that, in terms of inflation, you're talking 200 million plus. And Alan Shearer, famously turned down Man United to come to his boyhood club, and Kevin Keegan was a manager. And I believe that decision was heavily influenced by Kevin Keegan. Obviously, he unfortunately resigned, felt like he couldn't take the club any further. But then he came back in 2008 out of absolutely nowhere. The Messiah returned, but unfortunately didn't really go the way it should have done. Not winning in his 8 games as manager. But listen, it doesn't taint anything that Kevin Keegan did for Newcastle United. We call him a Messiah. You only have to see the tributes in the past couple of days of what Kevin Keegan meant to Newcastle United. I believe War Flags are doing a big tribute at St James's Park in the first game of the season. We actually do play Liverpool, ironically enough. So it would be very fitting for both sets of supporters to come together and remember what was a legend of a game. Legend gets thrown about quite a lot, doesn't it, in football? But Kevin Keegan's definitely been a legend, and at my club at Newcastle United, he'll absolutely never be forgotten.
There we go. That was Lewis with some reflections on Keegan's time at Newcastle. And yeah, it's amazing to hear Lou talk about some of those, because some of those memories of Keegan managing Newcastle and that whole period, they kind of just etched into your brain, aren't they, really? So iconic, so many different things that happened, and just absolutely phenomenal. I mean, Gaz, 90s is where the Premier League boomed. Obviously, we've had managers at our club that have meant the world to us. Obviously, I look at Bielsa at Leeds, that passion, that dedication, that Messiah type figure. Obviously, you guys have had Klopp recently, who kind of, captured a lot of that spirit. And certainly Keegan was Newcastle's. Sorry, you want to mute?
Yeah, no, you're spot on, mate. Some managers and some players just identify with the clubs that they're at, don't they? And they fit in seamlessly, and he was like that with Newcastle. I think Lou made a really good point there right at the end, that it's so fitting that it's Newcastle Liverpool on the first weekend of the season. And I think it'll be absolutely fantastic if both sets of supporters get to pay the respects in the way that they want to who he was. Like you said, there was so many memories around that time growing up in the 90s, watching him manage Newcastle. If they score 4, we'll score 5. He used to say, didn't he? And he just attack. And it was fantastic to watch. And if they weren't playing against your team, they were playing against someone else, you wanted them to win, didn't you? Just because of the way they played. And And I remember, it's one of those occasions, I remember where I was when he resigned, and he said he couldn't take him any further, and that was a huge shock. And if I remember rightly, it was off the back of I think they'd beaten Spurs 7-0, or they'd absolutely hammered Spurs. And he said he'd looked at Jerry Francis, who was the Spurs manager that day, and just didn't want to go through what he was going through. And I think that was part of it. And yeah, just like you said, the memories, the strike, he used to just sign striker after striker after striker, didn't he? And they have Ferdinand up front, and then they signed Shearer, and it was like, are they going to play together? And he did. He put them both together. And yeah, just it was just like you say, it was. They talk about the 90s and like obviously New Labour and everything that was going on with Britpop and all that. And I think Keegan's Newcastle were probably a part of that at the time. Just the sort of exhilaration that was going on around the Premier League, it was such a big part of it. And it's a time that as you and I grew up in, and we won't forget the contribution that he had to football in the 90s.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's one of those sliding doors moments, you know, they got a 10-point lead that year over Man United, and you wonder if they'd have been able to see it out and win a league title. You know, could he have been there for a decade and won, you know, trophy after trophy? You just don't know. I mean, I certainly got the sense with him as well, that kind of burnout, you know, similar to kind of what Klopp said when he left, you know, about energy running out, and it showed him, and he clearly gave everything to that club. But you know, he still had successes after it. Obviously, at first, you know, he got Fulham promoted, then took the England job. There was Man City after that. I mean, we mentioned at the start of the show about his kind of stint at England. I remember us in Euro 2000, and we were 2-0 up against Portugal. You thought, wow, he's bringing that Newcastle entertainer style to England. You thought, amazing. And then, unfortunately, it kind of turned against us and could never quite get it going with England to the point, you know, where he could be successful. But it was one of those, you know, he wasn't going to stick around for compensation, was he? If he'd had enough, he was going to leave.
Yeah, it was quite interesting that interview was doing the rounds yesterday, the one we spoke about earlier, the one where he basically resigned live on telly after it was a final game at the old Wembley. They'd lost to Germany. I think Dietmar Hamann scored for Germany, and they beat us 1-0. And he said that the reaction of the fans as he was leaving made him think that my time's up. And because he had been the people's choice to take over from Glenn Hoddle, because that he was who the fans wanted him, so much so that when he first took the job, he actually job shared it with the Fulham. He stayed on at Fulham and carried on managing Fulham, did England at the same time, because he was, like you said, Browney, he took Fulham up. He had success with Fulham, and then they wanted him with England. And he nearly, actually, if I remember rightly, for that Euro 2000, we nearly didn't qualify. I think that was when we had the playoff against Scotland to qualify, and obviously Paul Scholes scored. I think we won 2-0 at Hampden, and we lost 1-0 at Wembley. Don Hutchison scored, but we did get over the line. We did qualify, and then, like you say, in the tournament, I think we had Germany in our group, and we actually beat Germany.
Yeah, the last game, was it, I think?
Yeah, it was the first time we'd beaten Germany in a competitive fixture since 1966. And that was the game everyone was worried about in that tournament, the one that we thought we'd lose. And then we ended up losing to Portugal and to Romania. And like you said, the Portugal game was a typical Keegan game. I think we were 2-0 up after about 20 minutes, and we lost 3-2. And then I think we needed a draw against Romania, did we, to go through or something? Yeah. And Phil Neville fouled, was it Dan Petrescu in the box? And scored a pen right at the end, and we lost, and we were out. And he still stayed on after that tournament. The fans, even though he had from what I remember, even though he had a really low win percentage, it was like one of the lowest win percentages recent years as an England manager, like 30-odd%. The fans stuck with him, and the fans wanted him to stay because he was a man of the people. And it was only when we lost that game at Wembley and that he felt the fans turning, that he decided it was time to go. And I think he'd been in. I think they said he was a long while coming down for his interview after that match. And when he actually got him on air, he said he'd told the players that he was resigning, and then he'd gone straight to the chief of the FA and told him that he was resigning. And they'd actually tried to convince him to stay, but his mind was made up just because he felt, like we keep saying, that he'd lost the will of the people. So he felt that once that had gone, and after they'd stuck with him for so long, and now he'd always been such a popular figure, he thought now that was the right time to go.
Yeah, and then bounces back with Man City job and gets Man City promoted, and you know, you could arguably say put in wheels in motion in terms of, you know, a few years later Man City get plucked. to get the cash bonanza they did and become a force in English football. As Lou mentioned, there was a return stint to Newcastle, but it was kind of under that black cloud of Mike Ashley at the time, and then that was it, and that kind of rounds us up to where we're at with everything. I mean, your final kind of thoughts and feelings on King Kev, Gaz?
Just the sort of sentiment that I've put out there all the way through, that when anyone passes away, if nobody has a bad word to say about them, they've done something right, haven't they? And I don't think I've heard anybody, not just in the obituaries that have gone since he passed, but even when he was alive, nobody ever had a bad word to say about it. He did so much for charity, so many interviews. You hear about him just spending hours and hours after games, just signing autographs for people. He came from a working class background, and I don't think that ever left him, and that's why his work ethic was always there, and that was why he was always a man of the people. And as I say, and ultimately the one time he thought he'd lost that with England was the time he said, enough's enough, and that's obviously the utmost respect and for the man, and one of the great English players from the last sort of 50 years, and one of the most popular managers too. And it's just a sad loss. So yeah, rest in peace, Kevin Keegan.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll leave it there. Thanks to everyone who watched along. And if you want to get your comments in later, please feel free to do, and also subscribe to the channel. I've been Stephen Brown. Thank you to Lewis Sale and also Gaz. Thank you, Gaz. And we'll catch you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.